I participated in service opportunities and leadership first in the summer of 1998, which I guess would have been after my sophomore year. And then I participated again in 1999 in what we called then Soul 2, and graduated in 2000. And presently, I'm actually between jobs. You caught me my last day. And my last employer was on Friday. I was working most recently at the United States International Trade Commission, which is a federal government agency. And on April 15th, I'll be starting a new job at Microsoft.
Oh, that's exciting. What will you be doing for Microsoft?
For Microsoft, I will be the senior manager for international trade. So what that means is I will help the company develop its strategy related to international trade policy and help it do advocacy in Washington, D.C. and around the world on trade issues.
And saying that you did two summer projects with Hart Leadership Program, can you speak a little bit about what you did over those 2 summers?
Yeah, absolutely. So first summer, I went to Croatia, actually, and I worked with an NGO called the International Catholic Migration Commission, and the idea of the program was to help people who had fled from Croatia during the war there. There was a war. There were wars throughout the Balkans in the early 1990s. The war in Croatia ended in 1995. As in other places in the Balkans, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing. So in the part of Croatia that I went to, ethnic Serbs had been pushed out of the country. And so what was happening there was ICMC, the NGO I worked with, was offering microloans to refugees to entice them to come back and get their lives restarted, to help them have a livelihood if they chose to come back. So the field office I went to was a brand new one. They were just starting the program. It wasn't clear what I'd be doing when I went, but the idea was to help out in some way. Just to summarize what happened, I spent about a month trying to get my footing. It was very challenging because I went in thinking, I guess like a lot of soulsters, that perhaps I could save the world, and discovered within a few weeks that not so fast. It was very humbling to realize you really have no idea what you're doing. And so this gets into leadership lessons, but in short, I kind of faced the challenge of figuring something out or going home. And what I ended up doing was a research project where I went to villages throughout that part of Croatia that were receiving returnees to do a needs assessment to find out if the programming of the NGO was properly attuned to what they needed, and if not, to see how it could be adjusted. So I ended up doing dozens of interviews throughout 12 or 13 villages throughout that region over a period of several weeks, and I prepared a report that I then briefed the leadership of the NGO on. My second summer, I again was working on refugee issues, but this time in the United States. I worked with an organization called the Center for Community Self-Help, or it has a branch called the Self-Help Credit Union, and this was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they were piloting a project to offer refugees in North Carolina microloans to start businesses. I ended up identifying the major refugee communities throughout Charlotte, and then developing profiles of those communities for self-help, and specifically of business owners and prospective business owners to find out specifically what their challenges were as they sought to set up businesses. Did they really have difficulty accessing credit? Did they have the skills they needed to start a business? And I prepared these brief reports on each community that I then briefed both self-help and the Office of Refugee Resettlement on. To that point in my life, it was particularly the first experience was the most humbling experience I've ever had. It sounds naive, but maybe when I went into Duke, I don't think I was an arrogant person, but I felt like I'd rarely encountered something that I just couldn't find any way of doing, but I was lost. And I really had to look within myself in a way I'd never had to before to find my way. It was the most challenging experience in my life up to that point. And I guess what I took away from it is sometimes I think the other thing is as a student, I'd excelled at being a student up to that point in my life, but often excelling at being a student means getting an assignment and doing really well at what somebody tells you to do. This was a case where I had to figure out what the assignment was. I had to figure out what the project was. Nobody was going to tell me how to make this work. And time and again throughout my career since Seoul, I found that it's been, in order to succeed, it's been on me to figure out what the problem is, to figure out what the challenge is, and then devise a solution to it. Never had a better, it was a trial by fire in that sense. The challenge the second summer was very similar, but at least I'd already been through it once before, so it wasn't as scary. Yeah.
Well, Alma brags on you a little bit and calls you the father of the research service learning here at Duke.
Oh.
So I was just wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit about what that necessarily entails, how you came to really implement it and make it an integrated part in the Duke curriculum.
Accidentally? No, I guess Alma's too generous there, because Alma's the mother of research service learning, no doubt about it. But I think in coming back from Croatia, and I hope I've got this sequence right, I know that in talking with Alma, I felt like I'd stumbled upon something interesting, which was when I reached that point of figuring out how can I be helpful here, the question I had to ask myself was, what do I know how to do well? Do I know how to do anything? I was feeling clueless, but what I realized is, as a student, as a Duke student, one thing I learned how to do was research, to have questions that I'm tasked with learning more about, to do research both with books or in interviewing people, and then to synthesize the information and produce it in a digestible format that leads to helpful conclusions. These are the things we learn as Duke students. You learn how to analyze, you learn how to write, you learn how to present. And so I worked with Alma, I guess it was actually after the second summer, once I'd done this again, I sort of followed this approach, we decided to try and formalize it together. So I worked as sort of a volunteer with the Seoul program as its first research service learning coordinator to try and come up with some principles of how you go about assessing what is the need of the organization you're working with, and then working with those who are there to identify the best ways at uncovering the information that's needed to arrive at a solution. So it's not, I guess the key, what I'm getting at there is, I think a lot of the research we were taught to do is somewhat theoretical. With research service learning, it's all about application and coming up with information that can change a program or an organization or a policy for the better.
And I guess since graduating, what overall lessons from the Hart Leadership Program have you implemented in your current work, and what tools have you since had to learn?
So I can sort of divide that into two categories. One is sort of what we've been talking about, which is the analytical side. This basic approach of standing back from diagnosing a problem, trying to find a way to design a research method to go about arriving at a solution by gathering information and doing analysis, time and time again. That's been part of what I'm doing. One lesson I took away from all these classes, from my summer experiences, was that there's leadership that happens in a formal context where you're a person in a position of authority, but then there's leadership that happens not in a formal leadership position. And throughout my career, I've seen people in positions of authority who did not exercise leadership well, and I've seen people not in positions of authority who exercise leadership really well. And so I guess that's the biggest lesson I learned, is that you don't have to have a specific title or be given a certain formal power in order to exercise great leadership. So for example, in my last job, I led teams of people to do research on questions that were asked of us by Congress or by the president to inform international trade policymaking. And in some cases, I was a formal project leader. And with that, the way to exercise leadership was more explicit. You were the head of the project, but on other times I was just a team member. But there was at least a few occasions where I saw that the formal project leader didn't have a good handle on how to go about attacking the problem, to approaching the project, where I stepped in an informal way to help the project leader reach the goal. And what I learned from Alma is that sometimes that's what leadership is all about, is can be often leading from behind. You don't have to be up on the stage in the front to be a great leader.
How would you characterize yourself as a leader?
Somebody who's often more comfortable leading from behind, in the sense that I don't need to be the one on the stage at the end of the day getting the credit for the work. I'd rather be the person who's working with the team all the way leading up to that. If others are up there getting the credit at the end, that's fine. But what I really feel, I hope is my strength, and what I work at as being my strength, is always starting by listening. So most of my work has involved work in teams, and I try to never be the one to lead off in terms of when we're discussing a problem. I want to hear what others have to say, let everybody get everything they've got, their thoughts on the table, and then I'll put mine out and we'll work together to try and come up with what the best approach is. And then if you do it that way, what I find is at the end of the process, everybody feels some ownership over it. It's a lot more satisfying to everyone involved if it's not one person's baby. So that's kind of the approach I am.
As students head out into the real world, do you have any advice for them?
I guess one thing I would say is, it sounds obvious, but keep an open mind. I had to be willing to allow myself to turn stones that I never thought of turning before. Like I say, I never would dream that I'd be working at Microsoft. That just wasn't something I even thought of in the realm of possibility. But what's happened is if I've seen something that's piqued my interest, whether it be in school or in my work, I've followed that. So do follow your passions. It's good to have a plan. It's nice to have a trajectory in mind, but allow yourself to deviate when you see something that really calls to you. I guess I will say, frankly, it is important to think about making a good living too. And one thing I don't think I thought sufficiently about when I was coming out of college was that struck me as an either-or proposition. Either you take a vow of poverty and you go try and save the world, or you try and make a living. It doesn't have to be bifurcated like that. What I've seen over and over, whether in my own work or in others I know, is you can do well and you can also do good. So don't think that you have to make a simple choice there.
And I guess in closing, this is a bit of an abstract question, but what would you say is your overarching core purpose that drives you? Big question.
It's a big one. Well, one thing we haven't talked about, nothing's more important to me than my family and my children. And so I guess what I am first and what I am last is a father. And actually, everything I do now is towards a lens of what am I teaching my children about what it means to live a good life. And so in the work I do, whether it be the paid work I do during the day or volunteer work I do outside, I want them to see an example of how to live right. And I guess being of value and of service to your community is a vital goal to me, and caring about your neighbor. So whether that be your neighbor down the street or the country next to you. I guess when I think about my core purpose, it is about looking beyond myself to see how I can have the broadest impact possible in terms of creating a world that's better than the one I came into. That's kind of vague, it's kind of broad. It's what I'm shooting toward. There's one question on your list that I just didn't want to let go by. You asked about community service organizations that we think are of interest.
Yes, definitely.
I just want to make a plug for students coming out of Duke to think about government service. Because I know when I was coming out of Duke and I was thinking about public service, that wasn't where I was looking. I was looking at nonprofits. I was looking at NGOs. It didn't even occur to me that working in government could be something that would be satisfying and really interesting for somebody seeking to make a difference. I would just encourage folks to think about it as you come out, because it doesn't have to be that you spend your whole career there, but you can make a big difference if you're working at, whether it's in the Foreign Service, whether it's with a development agency like USAID, whether it's implementing U.S. policy and programs that help people. But also you can take that experience and carry it with you wherever you go. And what I've seen is that in the nonprofit world or in the for-profit world, people highly value experience in government and with public policy. So something to think about. And just a word of kudos to Sol and to the Hart Leadership Program. It was the most positive aspect of my experience at Duke, and I'm delighted to see it continuing strong. So thank you.